Speaking of St. Louis, why don't we talk about their new sporting director? Because I originally wasn't going to talk about this because I was like, we don't really do sporting directors, not really part of our, our breakdown. We don't follow them as much. But this is kind of interesting to me because of the way everything happened in St. Louis. So let me give you a little bit of background. And I don't know how to pronounce this guy's name. Luf Pantsil, I think his name is, or Fantsil, something very funky. Lots of letters that you don't actually pronounce.
Great
Um,
Scrabble name.
yeah, you get lots of points out of Scrabble on that one. He was, let go at the end of the season, or they moved on from him, and they've brought in, or on the verge of signing, according to Tommy Scoops, Corey Wray as their new sporting director. A background on Corey Wray, because obviously, like I said, we don't keep up with the front office stuff as much as we do with the coaches and the players and the teams. Ray comes most recently from CF Montreal, who was their sporting director over there. Before CF Montreal, he was the assistant GM with Toronto and Columbus, being a part of three MLS Cup teams in 2017, 2020, and 2023, which means if anything is going to go well, put a bet for St. Louis to win MLS Cup because it seems like every 3 years this guy brings one in. So they're due for one. While at the Crew, he also won MLS Next Pro Executive of the Year in 2022 and was a finalist in 2023 for Crew 2 and putting that all together. What are your thoughts on the move? And I know you probably don't have a lot because again, we don't talk about this much, but I'm curious if you do have anything off the dome.
Yeah, I did a little bit of research on this.
Ooh.
I was also curious to see what people were saying about bringing him in. People seem to be pretty optimistic about it, but I think, granted, I think whenever people are in a situation where they don't know too much about whoever is coming in, they're cautiously optimistic when it comes to their team, unless unless you've been beaten down so bad, you're like the Jets, and you're just like, you know not to get your hopes up. But people were optimistic in St. Louis, and I think a lot of people in the comments were focusing on his time in Toronto and Columbus and kind of writing off his time in Montreal as just being in a difficult situation and probably not his fault. And I wholeheartedly, and I've said this probably a million times at this point, I do not disagree with that. I 100% can understand where people are coming from on that, and it is probably has a lot of validity to it. But the one thing I will say, and maybe I'm being too harsh on them, but I feel like thus far, St. Louis hasn't exactly given themselves the best track record to say that they're easy to work with because they've been around since 2023. They've already been through four coaches. Granted, some of those were caretakers, but each coach has coached for 15 plus games. So in a 3 season period, you have now gone through four coaches who have had significant time with the team, all of whom are probably bringing in different ideas and different tactics, and guys have to keep changing the way that they're playing. And not on top of all of that, your first coach was a super successful coach, and he did miracles with your team. And then, the second season comes around, and things aren't going as well as they did the first year, and you move on very quickly. I think we had this discussion. Yes, St. Louis was not trending in a good direction, but I think we both agreed that it was kind of fast, especially for what he was able to accomplish with the team in the first year. And I think this season pretty much confirmed that because you let him go. He goes on to the next team within the league, wins the Supporter Shield. Maybe you should have kept that guy. I don't know. So I'm looking at the situation where people are like, oh, in his last role with Montreal, like he was just working with a bit of a difficult organization, and so maybe that's why he wasn't getting results. But it's like the way that St. Louis has been in the last 2 years, I'm not necessarily sure that it's going to be so much better. Like, yes, St. Louis is willing to spend money, but the way, unless you're going to like gut the roster, the way that they're set up right now, there's not a lot of money to be spent. You're kind of cuffed on how much you're going to be able to do in this new role. So I think he's got a good track record. His time in Toronto and Columbus is valid. Granted, it was from an assistant role, but I think, you can look at what he was able to do as GM for Crew 2 and be a winner of Executive of the Year and a finalist in another year. So like that's promising. But I'm concerned that like maybe it's more of an organizational thing in St. Louis right now than it is we needed a new director of soccer.
think it's a lot of good points, and the big one that stood out to me right away is his time at Montreal isn't really his fault as much as it is, the ownership and not giving him the tools to do his job, right? But my first initial thought is this is underwhelming. And right, because of that CF Montreal side, regardless of what he was given, they were very bad last year. And we just spent the last two sections talking about form coming into a job impacts your job, regardless whether you're a player, coach, front office. If you come from an area where you're not doing so well, you may carry that into the next job. Then I think that there is a gap between being a good assistant executive or MLS Next Pro executive and a good MLS executive. I think there's a relatively good gap there, right? There's learning curves. There's a lot more that you have to balance and get right. And I'm not disappointed, underwhelmed, or happy or thrilled. I'm just interested, right? Again, I think that if this team gets healthy and they get the right coach in, I don't think that their roster is in a bad spot. I think they've got a lot of really good tools. This season coming in, I don't think his impact is going to be super. I don't want to say impactful. I think impactful is the wrong word, but I think that he's going to have time to get comfortable in the role and figure out what he has to do before he has to start making some big decisions, right? Most importantly, of course, is going to be the coach, but we'll move on from there. But the reason I wanted to bring this up was the way that St. Louis has gone about doing this is very interesting, right? He's supposedly supposed to be the soccer decision guy, right? Hirings, firings, signings, selling players, whatever, right? Well, before he was even announced, or my guess is before he was even interviewed for the position, St. Louis already made every single one of their end of year roster decisions, and they signed Roman Berkey to a new DP contract. Some are saying that the president of the team, Diego Gigliani, is going to have a what has been labeled a hand, air quotes in a hand, in many soccer decisions. If that's the case, and you already have somebody who's making the decisions for him, why are you bringing him in the first place? If you want him to be the decisions guy, why not let him make those decisions first? If you don't want him to be the decision guys, why are you bringing him in at all? And the only way I can kind of wrap my head around this is that he's had a lot of success as an assistant GM with somebody helping him make these decisions, right? So maybe they think that if he has somebody assisting him or he's assisting somebody in making these decisions, he'll find more success. It just feels very not normal. And again, for two of us who don't pay attention to front office happenings, right? It just feels a little abnormal. And I'm just curious to kind of see how it plays out.
No, that's fair. I mean, that's like the situations where you see it's baffling and I don't understand it, but I think to like American sports where it's like, oh, our team just had a really bad year. We are thinking about making a move or making a change, and then it's like, oh, we're gonna let the GM handle like the draft coming up. And then it's like after the draft is done, you fire the coach and or you fire the GM and you get a new one. It's like, okay, well then you should have done that to start with. Like these are important decisions to make. Like end of your roster decisions is important to make. Using a third DP slot is an important decision to make. You're gonna do all that and then bring somebody in? Like that doesn't make somebody in whose like job it is to make those decisions. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. And again, I'm sure that there's a plan in there. Lots of behind the scenes stuff that we don't know, but it's going to be interesting to watch this one play out for sure because it just doesn't. There are pieces, and again, this goes back to the beginning of the last season, hiring Olaf Melberg, where it was like, or rather the middle of last season, firing Olaf Melberg, where it's like something doesn't feel right in the front office. Like 15 games and you're already pivoting, like you don't trust the guy. It just everything kind of feels up in the air. It's gonna be very interesting to see how that plays out.